Valerie holds a master's in international business and foreign languages from the University of Angers, France, and also holds a BA in European Studies from the University of Hull, UK. Valerie, you are welcome to today's webinar. Please take over. If you wish to ask any question, kindly use the Q&A facility on Zoom and then pose your question there. Thank you.
So thank you, Doreen, for this nice introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe, first of all. So thank you for joining again if you attended the webinar on open science last week, kindly organized by AfLIA, and welcome to newcomers in particular. So I'm glad to see that many participants in the webinar series on repositories today. So I was just introduced by Doreen. So as you say, I work for Emerald Publishing. I've been working in that company for 12 years roughly, and I lead the Emerald Publishing service, whereby we publish journals, open access, on behalf of institutions or societies. We currently have 56 partners worldwide. So that's it for the introduction. So last week, I'll start sharing my screen. I mean, I've got the slides. I'm showing my slides. Right. I want that here. So I will switch off my camera once I finish my introduction, so that just to mitigate any connection issues. And then I'll put it back on when we come to Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So I started last week webinars on a definition of open science, challenges, benefits, and the open science landscape initiatives in Africa. So just as a quick reminder, so open science is an umbrella term that actually involves various movements of open, aiming to remove the barriers for sharing any kind of output, resources, methods, or tools that at any stage of the research process, okay? And we discussed that one way that librarians can actually support open science is through the development of shared infrastructures within their institutions. And that can include the launch of an institutional repository, which is the topic of our webinar today. So although the title on that slide actually says institutional and national repositories in Africa, I will focus in particular on institutional repositories, just to make it more relevant to your role of librarian into your institution. I'd like to specify that I won't go through the technicalities, or practical steps of setting up an institutional repositories. As a publisher, that's not my area of expertise. But what I would like to give you as insight is give you information around the landscape of institutional repositories in Africa currently, where the challenges lie mostly, and how to get started. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll show you further resources which actually delve into details on how setting up an institutional repositories. There may be questions that at the end I'm not able to answer. For that matter, if I'm not able to, I may ask someone from the audience, the participants panel, to give their insights if possible. So I will switch off my camera now, and thank you for listening in advance. If I can. Okay. Okay. So what's the agenda for today? So we'll look at the definition of what is an institutional data repositories. We'll, quite interestingly, we'll actually cite of what's the evolving landscape of institutional repositories in Africa. We'll review the benefits and challenges of institutional repositories, but relevant again to the continent. And then finally, I'd like to draw some key recommendations for developing successful repositories. And then also talk about advocacy and support, which is really key to the success of launching and managing a successful institutional repository. So the definition of an institutional data repository. Simply, institutional repositories, or IRs, are databases that provide services for the capturing, storing, indexing, preservation, and redistribution of a university's scholarly research in digital formats. Academic libraries are indeed often involved in the creation and management of institutional repositories that really focus on preserving and disseminating scholarship produced by their institutions, faculty, and students. So what type of content are we talking about? So repositories can include article preprints and manuscripts, technical reports, conference proceedings, data sets and software, as well as theses and dissertations. For many libraries, actually, when they start with their repositories, electronic theses and dissertations are the first targets for a repository program. They represent an opportunity to engage graduate students and their faculty advisors in broader conversation about open access, intellectual property management, management of digital content, and other scholarly communication issues. Institutional repositories are particularly important for universities with open access policies that direct faculty to deposit final manuscripts of scholarly articles into repositories. They are further useful in helping researchers comply with the funder mandates on the accessibility of research data. I'd like to add here that as far as institutional repositories are concerned, material deposition is sometimes mandated by the institution. And that kind of reflects the trends of the number of institutional repositories recently launched in Africa, and what we'll see a little bit later on. So national, just to give you a little bit of definition of national repositories, really the difference between national and institutional repositories is quite simple. They have repositories, data repositories, or digital repositories, sometimes we call them, have the same objectives of sharing, disseminating, preserving content, but would refer, national repositories would refer to research data of a national scale, usually. So let's talk about the evolving landscape of institutional repositories in Africa. So in 2019, while nearly half of all African countries have some universities that now have digital repositories. Over half do not. And when one looks at a particular country, it's striking how many African universities have not yet got repositories up and running. So in the pie chart you can see here on the slide, South Africa and Kenya host the highest number of repositories, with 40 and 32 repositories respectively. In other countries, such as Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, the numbers were significantly lower, between 5 and 15. In 16 countries, including Angola, Benin, Chad, the Gambia, Somalia, and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, no data on digital research repositories could be found. Additional repositories have been added for Kenya, about 10, Uganda, about 5, and Sudan, 7, all representing significant increases in the materials available for these countries. There have been new repositories listing for Libya and Algeria, and in the smaller countries, there's one new repository in Botswana and one in Lesotho. Overall, the repository landscape looks strongest in East, Southern, and North Africa. I'm going to try to register. So when actually looking at these numbers, it's important to remember also that digital repositories can only make contributions to the scholarly process if certain conditions are met. And that's not the case of all countries across Africa, unfortunately. So a repository has to be well organized, searchable, and operate in accordance with open access principles so that it is accessible to anyone using the internet. So effective use of repositories also needs scholars in any particular African country or university to have effective access to desktop or laptop computers, adequate broadband width, and dependable power supplies. So the kind of numbers across African countries on number of repositories then will probably also reflect the capabilities that each country has around infrastructure and internet connection and power supply. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I think what's really encouraging though to see is the way that the number of institutional repositories have increased across continents, and so how open access and open access principles have been more adopted across the continent over the past few years in particular. And so, you know, depending obviously on the university means. So I'll talk now about the benefits of setting up institutional repositories, and then next the challenges. So the key benefits relevant to any countries, but particularly in African countries, so include obviously the fact that institutional repositories can maximize the availability, accessibility, discoverability, and functionality of scholarly research outputs at no cost to the user. Most of the research outputs by African academics and researchers gather dust in the various departmental offices and institutional libraries without getting published, unfortunately. So it's consequently very important that research outputs from Africa should be available, accessible, and applicable so that it has an impact on the lives of millions of Africans and beyond. The establishment of institutional repositories in African academic institutions is therefore a serious development developmental issue that requires great attention. Repositories can also play an important role in the preservation and dissemination of institutional research outputs. Given these attributes, repositories have the potential to play an important role in development, mainly because they enhance access to and the sharing of research-based information generated in specific countries or continents. It's particularly important, I think, for African countries, where researchers are probably have less opportunities to share their research output. Just to specify. So scholars in a particular African country will much more easily be able to find out who else in their country is doing or has in the past done research on a particular topic. So repositories do increase collaboration between researchers, and that's my third bullet point. The scientific advance has always proceeded on the basis of each generation having access to what already exists and standing on the shoulders of those who came before them, thereby taking the process of expanding knowledge further. So digital repositories in Africa will facilitate African scholars in any particular country in touch with one another where they share similar or related interests. In this way, more effective research networks can be built. Repositories will also help African scholars in one country to know about the research on their topic in other African countries. So it's really important, and it's really a very good way of advancing research. Digital repositories in African universities would help redress the ongoing balance in accessible research about Africa, authored by African and Western scholarly respectively, as I mentioned a little bit before. Across the social sciences and in other disciplines during the half of century since the end of the colonial era, the published record on Africa, both journal articles and books, is still overwhelmingly non-African in authorship. In this regard, Africa remains very different from Asia, China, and Latin America. The reasons relate to Africa's political and economic trajectory since independence. But the world of African scholarship would, if the spread of African repositories is carried through successfully and at scale, become seriously less imbalanced, as these platforms made accessible research produced by scholars working at African universities. I think this topic and this area of institutional repositories is even more essential for spreading research from African scholars. Finally, as the main producers of primary research, as the centers of scholarly content, academic and research institutions, whether in developed or developing countries, are expected to take an interest in the creation, dissemination, and preservation of knowledge. It's also important that these institutions engage themselves in better ways of collecting, preserving, and disseminating research output are produced in the institution, thus promoting scholarly communication. There are quotes for setting up institutional repositories and managing them, particularly in Africa. So some include, as I mentioned before, inadequate city connectivity and infrastructure. So remains really a key challenge. So these issues are one of the major obstacles that results in the unavailability of content when one visits a particular repository website. So all of these really play a role in making research inaccessible at times. Cost is another challenge. It's a fact that there is the existence of a software that is open source and proprietary. It's also well understood that the majority of institutions go in for the open source one, which is entirely free, so that they can customize or scheme it to suit their own specifications. Whether open source or proprietary, there's always a cost to take care of. And these costs mostly come in the form of maintenance and skilled IT person to check it for you and make sure contents are always available for retrieval. Funds, unfortunately, dedicated to repository upkeep and personal capacity building are scarce and vary significantly, largely depending on and limited by national governmental investments in research and innovation or donor contributions. Lack of skilled staff is another challenge. In some universities or repositories, the skills, knowledge, and abilities required may be expected of an individual repository post with the assistance of a general IT person. However, many institutions spread the work over two main posts. One, a repository manager, who manages the human side of the repository, including contents policies, advocacy, user training, and a liaison with a wide range of institutional departments and external contacts. And a second post, who is the repository administrator, so who manages the implementation, the customization and management of the repository software, manages the metadata fields and quality, and creates usage reports and tracks the preservation issues. And a particularly important part of this role is the checking of copyright compliance. So these are the functions that quite often staff, in libraries will take up, or as far as I understand, there's also, there can be a lack of skills or knowledge within this remit. So sometimes other institutions spread the work over several posts or several departments, typically including library catalogers, subject librarians, teaching and admin staff, as well as IT services. Very much depends on, again, the funds you have available and the capabilities to train library staff. And I'll come to something else as well later on, and obviously would depend on the strategies, objectives of the institutions. There's a lack of institutional repository policy. The first step in launching repositories is to set up policies regarding the content, the self-archiving procedure, and the introduction of relevant routines, the kind of formulation of best practice that would secure the effective and widespread use of the repositories by all members of the academic community. That very much depends as well on how well your institution, let's say, is oriented, how well is implementing open access initiatives, and how well actually they're implementing open access policies. This is all connected. Authors' attitudes towards depositing their research can be a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. The refusal or unwillingness of some researchers to share their content, coupled with copyright issues, make it difficult for repositories to achieve their aim. Some members in the academia have different perception of institutional repositories, and so do not want to have anything to do with it, and it makes it hard and defeats the purpose of knowledge sharing, unfortunately. Copyright is a challenge to repositories that strive to or provide open access to the scholarly publication by its faculty and students. Authors cannot necessarily load their publications into the repositories without publishers' permissions, and sometimes embargo periods are imposed. From an Emerald perspective, particularly, we have a green open access policy whereby actually authors are allowed to deposit their preprint, or actually also their accepted manuscript, not actually published manuscript, but accepted manuscript with no embargo period, so as soon as it's accepted. So most scholars and students do not understand copyright issues, even though they welcome the idea of open access and institutional repositories. So there's quite a lot of education, again, to get involved in around this. So copyright information will definitely be a great help to faculty and students who want to submit their publication. Finally, there's definitely insufficient advocacy and lack of reward systems and incentives. This form quite a strong barrier to the adoption of institutional repositories, and we'll seek solutions to this particular challenge later on. So to try to help you, I think definitely some of you already manage institutional repositories, and that's why I'm kind of interested in hearing from you for any response to any questions afterwards. But I've set out some recommendations for developing successful institutional repositories. So, and these recommendations can be made. The first point really is that universities should ensure that there is adequate capacity for managing and developing repositories, including training and support. But really, it's finding out about your, again, the resources, the funds you have, your institution is ready to invest or to finance for institutional repositories. University libraries should adopt a strict enforcement policy regarding copyright issues, the quality of content and access use of the institutional repositories. So library staff need to establish content management policies, since they are experienced at selecting, describing, storing and managing content. They can negotiate with academic staff on which content to prioritize. But a strong policies and adherence to them is key to a successful institutional repository. Universities could prepare mandatory policies for the submission of all types of intellectual output, including research articles. Quite a lot of institutional repositories do that now. Universities should create a promotional plan to help maximize the engagement in institutional repositories for the global dissemination of their institution's research outputs. Really, to beginning with, it's crucial that a meeting involving all stakeholders to be held under the auspices of the university should be organized to initiate targeted conversations. So university and library management, academic and library staff. Such a meeting should provide answers to some of the key questions. Key questions that include: what problems are repositories trying to solve? What repositories behavior would you like to see? How can stakeholders work together to incentivize the use of repositories? How can stakeholders make everyone accountable? University management, library management, academic staff, and institutional repositories managers. It's not just down to one person, it's down to a cross-functional team. And what staff, ICT infrastructure do you need? So these are all really the questions you need to answer to really the suggested meeting seems a necessary step in effecting changes within the world of repositories, many of which suffer due to insufficient resources. So what's really important here to retain is that institutional repositories are set up initially to meet the needs of the institution. Okay, so it's therefore important to work towards it as a cross-functional team and to find out what the needs of your institution is in an institutional repository. What is it going to index? Who do you want, you know, to have submitted their research onto the repositories? How are you going to preserve? What software are you going to use? How are you going to disseminate? How are you going to actually create a advocacy plan to make sure you have your staff, faculty staff and students submitting the repositories? So what really do they try to address within your institution? It's really important just to remain relevant, okay? And how does that go, is it going to complete your open access policy, your open access initiatives within the institutions? It has to be relevant. So I mentioned before advocacy and support. So advocacy and support are really important to make sure the institutional repositories are successful, i.e. that they've been used simply by your staff. So a crucial factor, so as I say, is the promotion of it among staff and students. To this end, library staff need to support institutional repository relentlessly. Changing the culture of academic communications is no easy task at all, and academic acceptance is bound to remain very slow. That's what you need to keep in mind. But for many researchers, also repository is an uncommon term. So advocacy is really a critical aspect of any institutional repository project. As a survey of early institutional repository, implementation suggests practical advocacy and education programs can assume a variety of forms. And so this include the creation of written materials. So for instance, produce a briefing paper for presenting the institutional repository case to relevant faculty and administration committees. They should be concise and include specific recommendations for action. Distribute literature, place articles and advertisements in university magazines, the library user newsletter, and so on. Establish a project website linked to and from the archive itself. This can act definitely as a focus for developments and news. Identify existing problems that the repository can solve for departments and faculty. Positioning institutional repositories as solving existing problems provides a more straightforward approach to encourage early participation than the presentation of more abstract prospective benefits. As I said, be relevant. Make sure that repositories address a key issue within your institution. Present at departmental meetings and university committees about the repositories. Quite importantly, really, I try to identify champions amongst the faculty, particularly non-polarizing opinion leaders, to spread the word on the library's behalf. That is really important. These are people that will be engaged with you and will be engaged with any open access initiatives, including repositories. Develop an early adopter program with departments, labs, schools, university presses, and other entities that are likely to see the benefits of participation I mentioned very early in my presentation that quite often librarians start by targeting or by storing contents, theses and dissertations, because it's much easier to target graduate students and their connected university staff to really build up on that and start a strong program from the beginning. And definitely an early adopter program is very useful in that respect. Foremost and finally, university librarians are key to assist in the setting of research data management policies. And that's a subject, a topic that we'll talk through next week. And this research data management policy should include depositing research data on repositories. And if you have institutional repositories, they should include an element of depositing research on your institutional repository. These are the very useful reviews. I'm really inviting you to read further, in particular if you wanted to find out practical step on how to set up institutional repository. I would definitely recommend that you read the Spark Institutional Repository Checklist and Resource Guide, which is the third bullet point. With regards to staff and skill sets, do look through this, this particular PDF from isp.ac.uk. We've also, Emerald also published a very good paper on the strategies for the use of open access institutional repositories at the universities in Ghana. This is actually from 2020, so I invite you to read it. If you can't access it, because it's not open access, unfortunately, I have to say, I'm very happy to distribute the PDF, so you can actually read it at your leisure. And finally, this last bullet point actually lists the different research repositories and maps the landscape of digital repositories across Africa. Very useful read. The very first bullet point actually indicates where you can find a directory of data repositories in Africa. Whenever you set up an institutional repository, make sure you get it, you know, it's actually considered as a trusted repository. Make sure you actually get it listed into data repositories list, such as Doreen, the top one. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, I think Doreen will take them. I hope this has given you a bit of insight into institutional repositories. There are obviously lots of technical and resource aspects you should consider. And again, the resources I've highlighted will actually give you a better clue. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you. This is good. We've learned new things today. And thank you, all attendees. We are live on Facebook. So thank you to all the Facebook listeners. Thank you for joining us. We are going to take questions. We're going to answer the questions. So, Valerie, the first question I have here is a set of questions. It says, 1, what is the difference between IR administrator and a manager? Yeah. 2, what role can a librarian play in setting up of institutional repository? And then 3, can library manage OER as well as IR? That's the first set of questions. So we'll continue. So after your answers, then we'll bring the another set.
Okay. So the difference, I mean, from the difference between an IR administrator and manager. An IR administrator will actually make sure, obviously, the content, that there is ongoing content, the content is actually submitted, but also well stored using the right metadata policies you've actually set. make sure it's actually preserved. So as I think I mentioned before, and that's why I'm just going to look through my notes again.
The second one is the role of, what role can a librarian play in setting up of an institutional repository?
Yeah.
That is the second question.
Yeah. So sorry, just going back to the administrator. So like I say,
okay.
Really the administrator manages the implementation, the management of repository software, manages metadata, fields, quality, creates usage reports, tracks the possession issues. So really this is the operational person behind the good management of repositories that would also create reporting to relevant academic staff to actually evidence the use of institutional repository, as opposed to the manager. The manager, I think, will have obviously be more responsible about advocacy, adoption, broadly speaking, of institutional repositories, but also setting up and enforcing policies. That's going to be really important. The role of the librarian with setting up institutional repositories. Obviously, so as I said before, the librarian is going to be a key member of the working team, helping to set up an institutional repository. A librarian is seen as a content manager who is aware of all sides of content. So, content types, content management, content preservation, content storing, etc. So it's going to be a key member of that team that will bring the AfLIA alive into your institution. That person is a kind of conductor. So it is going to be that key, not mentor, but that key element that is to provide, sufficient expertise on institutional repositories, but also the benefit for it, and particularly sufficient expertise around technicalities of institutional repositories. By no means it should be the only person dealing with institutional repositories. Like I said, there should be a cross-functional team from the universities setting up policies, agreeing on what type of repositories, what kind of data you want to store, what mandate do you want to give it to the repositories, and then and so on and so forth, and so to the policies. So that's important. But again, that's a key member of the team, not the sole. Everyone should be accountable. So the librarians, by no means the only person that's accountable for institutional repositories. And the last question was...
The last question is, can a library manage OER as well as an institutional repository? I think at the same time, concurrently, is it possible?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it's reviewing, assessing the capacity you have. You're actually doing both, and reviewing the priorities of your universities, whether or not you actually want to foremost concentrate on EORs, and then making sure you've got your, you create such awareness and as such develop open science policies, open access policies, to then look at and capacity you have for setting up and managing an institutional repository, particularly a successful one. That is going to be very important. So very much depends on the resources, and that's also resources, so staff resources, the skill sets, and the funds, the money you have available.
Okay, thank you. I would like to inform us, this is a short announcement, that AfLIA is currently in discussion with Creative Commons to have a panel discussion on 28th September. The adverts will go out, and so those interested can also join us. I also want to inform you that our call the call for our papers for our next conference is out, and it has to do, we have papers, Ignite talks, posters, and big idea podium proposals for the 4th conference. And this is a 4th conference which will be held in next year, May 2021. The focus is on 4th Industrial Revolution, sustainable development, and African libraries. Please, the advert is out. So if you want to write a paper, if you want to be a presenter during the conference, kindly go to our website or check on the call and apply. Okay, we continue with our questions. The next question is, how can we address the issue of library staff skills development to manage institutional repositories? Then there's another question I would like to take, then we can. How many IRs can a university have per faculty, school, or just one? How many IRs can a university have? Should it be based on faculty? Should it be on school based, or how should it be?
Okay, so how can librarians really manage I mean, how can university manage
the skills? Yeah,
resets? I think it's obviously very much depends on what directions the universities want to take. So if the universities want to actually set up institutional repositories and implement open, science policies as such, they should invest in the, upscale. I think in setting new skills to the librarians. So there are various actually courses online that do that. And I think AfLIA would probably be able to distribute resources or information on that. Or, I mean, there's different ways, either you can improve your skills yourself and then get assistance from your IT departments, or you can also recruit if the universities have enough funds, again, recruit staff that actually have expertise in setting up repositories and managing repositories. So definitely a skill set that is unfortunately probably there's a knowledge gap there that needs to be filled, and it's up to the universities really to create that fund to allow that gap to close. I mean, there's definitely lots of universities in South Africa and Kenya have done that. And I can't see, so if the universities have fund for it, appetite for it, I can't see why it shouldn't be done. I hope that answers your question. The second point is how many institutional repositories a university should have. There's no number, really. Very much depends on what objective the universities have of institutional repositories. And again, what resources, capacities and funds the universities have. Means if you are research institutions and if you are particularly strong within a discipline, a subject disciplines, then maybe you'll be, and that disciplines actually or subject have quite a bit of funds. So maybe you'll start small and you'll start by creating a subject repositories. So that is actually managed within the faculty itself, not necessarily managed by obviously at the university, the wider university staff. If you have minimum fund, but you're really keen to actually disseminate all research, so it's a small university, so all research from university, then you better set off a single institutional repositories. Very much depends where the university strengths are and how the size of the institution as well, and the appetite for it, university level or subject level, I would say.
Okay.
If anyone has actually, I'm not sure, but if anyone wants to add anything to my comments, please do so, because I'm sure there are librarians on the line who have actually expertise and experience in setting up institutional subject repositories.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions, and I'm going to take them some more. Okay, this is a scenario, so let me read. It says that researchers who understand open access and the benefits of it mostly tend to ignore the copyright issues regarding their articles and upload their papers into IR. Please, what are the penalties for doing this? And the second question also has to do, it says that what are the precautions or what precautionary measures should one take when uploading content into a repository, either academic content or academic IR or any institutional repository? So let's take those two.
Yeah. So the very first question again really relates to education around copyrights to staff and students. So it's going to be very important to educate your faculty members, to educate your students around copyright issues. So when actually they publish a paper, they're aware of the copyright issues that actually may be a hindrance to deposit their paper on institutional repositories. So as such, if they wanted to deposit their paper or needed to deposit their paper on institutional repository, they would have to be aware of the copyright policies of the journal or the platform they want to submit their research on. So it's very early on, they should be aware of that, okay? So if it's an open access platform or journal, or even a book series they want to publish in, that is not an issue because open access, CC by license, so you'll be able to upload your paper onto an institutional repository. That's absolutely fine. If it's actually a subscription journal, this is actually where the problem entails. And every publisher also can have very different copyright policies. So it's important that the author is aware of that copyright policy before actually getting accepted. I mean, for Emerald case, we implement a green open access policy whereby the accepted manuscripts can be deposited on the institutional repository with no embargo. However, there are very few publishers that have no embargo. Quite often, the researchers would have to wait probably 6 months to a year before he's able to, or she's able to, deposit their accepted manuscript onto the repository. So this is important to understand, really, for a researcher, obviously that's probably a detail that they don't want to pay attention to. But for an institutional, for librarian staff and content manager, in order to be able to store, preserve research published by your own institution, the researchers need to be aware of copyright issues. So education around that at an early stage is really important, starting with graduate students and so on, early career researchers, etc. It's quite interesting as well. So I think really institutional repository touch upon various elements of data management policies, which we'll actually talk through next week. What are the penalties? I mean, penalties. There's not. I don't think there are serious penalties as such. It could be that if a publisher finds out that a manuscript has been loaded onto a repository, the publisher may ask the author or the university staff to take it down. As such, I don't think, but from Emerald perspective, we don't check institutional repositories, because we've got no embargo period, so it's not really an issue for us. But there's no strong, strict penalties as such. There shouldn't be, apart from removing the paper.
Okay.
Precautionary measures when uploading content. I think what's important when you choose a repository is whether, if it's institutional, that's easy enough, that's your institutional repositories. If you, as an author, are mandated to deposit your research on your institutional repositories, then you should do it. You have to do it. Okay. If, as an author, you don't have an institutional repositories, then the choice is very wide. So really, authors should be mindful of what kind of repositories it is, so what kind of data that repository stores, what kind of subject disciplines it actually tackles, to make sure that it's relevant and seen by, viewed by relevant users and used by relevant users. Make sure that actually that repository is listed within category or listing directory of trusted repositories. Make sure as well that the license of that repository suits your needs in terms of, how do you want your research to be accessed, and how do you want your research to be used and reproduced.
Okay. Thank you. Talking about license, there's a question here. When setting up an IR, which type of license do we need? That is one question. The second one is, in terms of advocacy, what do you mean by setting up a project website? Mm-hmm. And the third one is, what is the connection between e-learning, e-teaching, and institutional repositories? So the first one has to do with what's in setting up an IR, which type of license do we need? The second one is, in terms of advocacy, what do you mean by setting up a project website? And the third one is, what is the connection between e-learning, e-teaching, and IRS, institutional repositories?
Okay. So in terms of license for setting up an institutional repositories, they should be open access, so they should really use a Creative Commons license, whereby actually, so the repositories can be read ideally, and where the research can be read for free and can be reused, reproduced as per by other researchers. Sorry. As easily as possible, so that actually the person, mass perspective, the research from Africa can really be showcased and highlighted by other researchers and other countries. If there are any participants who want to comment after that, happy to. In terms of developing a, again, it's probably also would actually differ, depend on the content you store, and there's really good source as well. I mentioned before that you should go to actually, depending on the type of data you store. Okay, so that's the Spark Institutional Repository Checklist and Resource Guide will actually give you information on licensing, but depending on type of content you want to store as well. So depending on the accessibilities you want, and depending on the type of content you store. So it's not a straightforward answer as well. Very much depends on, like I say, on content. With regards to advocacy, so project website, what I meant by project website is really, it's making this university staff aware of a launch and a development of institutional repository through web pages. So it's really highlighting, promoting the development of repositories by keeping the staff up to date with the latest development, sharing news, sharing challenges along the way. It's really useful, but also sharing case studies of authors who've already deposited their research on repositories before and what they found the benefits of. So it's that website will allow you to have hopefully engaged with university staff and try already to encourage, so have an early adoption program, support that program through a website. So it's just to encourage already people to think about submitting their papers onto the repository. So to think about copyright issues already again, and to think about, so it's also highlighting, connections between repositories and the needs of the institution and your faculties. That's going to be important. That institution repository should respond to a demand that you have in your university, okay, a demand that you have across the country, and that should be highlighted on that website.
Okay. The third one has to do with the connection or the connection between e-learning, e-teaching, and IRS.
Okay, so again, I think that would very much depend on what content you want to store on institutional repositories. Usually what actual data will be stored is so research output, so research papers, proceedings, preprints, technical reports, data sets and software, thesis and dissertation. So the e-learning or e-teaching, could obviously use the report to source data that would actually help towards the e-learning and the e-teaching. If it's for actually storing the courses that have been supplied through e-learning and through e-teaching, I think it's a question that you probably need to raise within your institutions of whether or not you want to store that data, whether or not you think that is useful to store, to showcase your institution.
Okay. All right. So I'll take some questions from Facebook because they are also listening to us. At the moment, we have 212 attendees who are listening attentively to your presentation, who have listened and they are listening to your questions. So we have quite a large number of people here. These questions are from Facebook. How can we manage the user demand in this pandemic situation? How can we assess their satisfaction? Is a question from Facebook. The second one is, how can a search engine be incorporated into an IR to enhance searching and retrieval of resources? The third one is, how best can the use of IRs be increased? So we take these three and then we'll continue. So the first one is, how can we manage the user demands in this pandemic situation? That is, how can we assess their satisfaction? Second one, how can a search engine be incorporated into an IR to enhance searching and retrieval of resources? And the third one is, how best can the use of IRs be increased? So those are the three that we take for now.
So the very first question, I think, manage the user demand within that pandemic context is a very, obviously, it's quite complex. Each country has faces its own challenges as such, faces its own restrictions, although there's some sort of unfortunately standardized restrictions we have across countries and continents. I think it very much depends on what resources, channels, and means the universities have put in place since the pandemic has started. So what resources do you have available? How do you communicate between one another? What actually ways of working do you currently have now? And how can these help with the demand or with identifying the demand you may have on launching an institutional repositories? so again, it's not a straight forward answer. I think all entities are different. The way they've actually adapted to the virus is different. So it's very much depends on what you've actually set up, and particularly I completely understand that the challenge is also internet connection issues across countries. Even across countries, this could be very, very different. And I don't know how you address that personally already in your faculty, in your institution, but it's trying to find a way to actually address that issue. So very much I can't answer that question very straightforward, unfortunately. I mean, it could be if you actually have very good internet connection, if your faculty has a good internet connection, I mean, it's engaging with all the staff you can access, and then find out through interviews, through surveys, through assessments of awareness of staff, whether or not they'd be interested in institutional repositories, is using the hopefully web conference facilities you have available to initiate university-wide meetings with relevant stakeholders. Again, I understand that's not straightforward. That very much depends on your internet connections and power supply as well. Okay. So the second question was about how can
incorporating search engines into IRs to enhance searching and retrieval of resources.
Yeah.
Incorporating search engines,
So this is to do as well with SEO, search engine optimization. I'm really sorry, I'm not an expert in that particular area. So if anyone has would like to answer that question, please do so. There is definitely some best practice to follow to make sure that actually your institutional repository is actually discoverable, and all that you actually can search in a very easy way within the institutional repositories. And I think that should be part actually of the software you decide to actually use for your repositories. That the last website, Mapping the Landscape, it's very interesting because you will read a paper on actually the implementation of repositories and the type of the software that actually most institutional repositories use. And I think so that's very that's a very useful read. I hope that answers somehow your question.
Okay. So there are more questions here. How can one avoid the issue of plagiarism when depositing a thesis in IR? The second one is, how can librarians guard against fraudulent activities in IRs? And the other one is, what's the best strategy to start an IR, national or institutional? So how can one avoid the issue of plagiarism when depositing a thesis in an IR? The second one is, how can librarians guard against fraudulent activities in IRs? And the third one is, what's the best strategy to start an IR, national or institutional repositories? Like, what is the best strategy? So those are the three questions here.
So avoid plagiarisms when actually uploading or depositing a thesis on institutional repositories. So, I mean, we publish thesis, I mean, from within a paper. So that usually is structured very differently to the thesis itself. That research paper would actually sometimes would actually split the thesis into different parts and elaborate a little bit further on the development of the topic of the issue of the thesis, so that it's not plagiarism as such, it's been developed. And that's that kind of angle that one could actually take. And whenever you want to publish your thesis into a paper, obviously reference your thesis. That's going to be key. If you don't want your thesis to be plagiarized, is that the question? There's no way to stop that as such. It's up to the author who use materials from your thesis, from the thesis, to cite the thesis, and not to obviously repeat word by word what's actually been put into the thesis. Quite often, actually, when researchers use thesis or into their papers, sometimes it's been identified by reviewers that actually some parts of this work has been read before. So these cases of suspicions of plagiarism are actually then communicated to us, and then we would run any paper through a software called Authenticate. That would actually identify the level of similarity between the paper that we're currently assessing and any research any research published before. So we can identify whether it's been plagiarism. That's obviously a way of stopping plagiarism and making sure that afterwards the author changes their paper. If not, that paper won't actually go through. As obviously open access, Creative Commons license, any, again, authors that use work from a repositories should cite that work. That should be part of a strong policy that should sit alongside the repository. Fraudulent activities, again, that's all down to having strict policies around ethics and permissions. So I would simply I would look through existing institutional repositories, particularly the ones listed in that directory of data repositories, but also listed in the African Digital Research repositories, and look through what policies they have in terms of ethics and fraudulent activities. I think they are very good models to use for more, actually very good people, networks you could actually talk to through AfLIA. So librarian staff who've already set up their institutional repositories. I can only say that strict policies would help towards that.
Right.
So best strategies for setting up either national and institutional repositories. So that's not quite the same scale when you talk about national repositories. So you talk about national-led research. So you also talk about making sure that you have governmental representations and policymakers, and that you have obviously a need for it, and you've got all the relevant stakeholders in place for setting up a national repositories and all the funds. In that case, I would definitely again look at refer to that directory of data repositories or in Africa, or list as well national repositories, and so would actually encourage to get in touch with these people on how to set up a national data repositories. Okay. I think definitely collaboration between universities at a national scale and between the government will be essentials for actually launching a successful APIah, and implementing successful ways of working and make sure that accountability is across all parties involved, and that there's a champion in all actors, in all institutions represented. Institutional repositories. So like I said, I think, you know, there's only one way to start, really, is by starting the discussions. It's looking at the needs of your universities toward an institutional repository. So establish already what open science, open access policies you have, how you can actually support open science. It might be that an institutional repository may be too quick for you to think of. You may actually have to think first about what you know about the level of awareness that your institution has towards open science and open access and open research, and then start with, you know, we talked about open education resources. We talked about open access, or, you know, facilitating publication in open access publications, etc. Then going on to institutional repositories, so thinking about how that institutional repository can respond to the need of your institutions, that particularly if, you know, when it's a research institution, quite buoyant, where research is increasing, and where actually unfortunately maybe researchers can't find a suitable a platform to actually make their papers, publish their paper, or make them discoverable, then that's a good way of an institutional repository. Then it's a good way of disseminating the scholarly input of your institution. And again, you can't do it on your own, so you have to have that initial discussions with you know, the relevant, the influencers of the universities, gathering you know, academic staff, subject staff, etc., library management and stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the presentation. It was insightful, and I'm sure most of us, or almost everyone, has benefited from this. I would like to inform all of us that we will share the resources with all of you, with all the registered participants, and the recording will be on our AfLIA YouTube channel for you, for those who would like to listen further or who would like to listen again. There's no need. The third webinar will be on the 8th of September. And so once you have registered, there is no need for you to register again. Please, all the questions that we were not able to answer will be answered in the third webinar. So don't lose hope. If your question was not answered, it will be answered in the third webinar. I also want to inform you that there will be certificates for participants who attend all the 3 webinars. If you attend all the 3 webinars, not come for 30 minutes and go, you finish, you listen to everything for all the 3 webinars, we will send you your certificate. This is I would like to repeat this announcement that we have sent out the call for papers, Ignite Talk, posters, and Big Ideas Podium presentation for the 4th AfLIA Conference and the 6th African Library Summit, which focuses on the theme 4th Industrial Revolution, Sustainable Development, and African Libraries. Please learn more on our AfLIA website, which we will send into the chat for everyone to check and click on it. So those who would like to be part of our conference, make presentations, kindly check our call and write your papers and submit it. The topic for our third webinar is on research data management practices and present challenges. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Stanley, please. you can take over. Thank you so much for coming. Stanley, any other announcement from the panel? Stanley, Dr. Nkem. All right. In the absence of further announcements, okay. Hello,
Yeah.
Stanley, go ahead.
Go ahead, please. Just wrap up and then.
Okay. In the absence of any further announcements, we will close for today, and then we meet again on the 8th September 2020. The time still remains 10 a.m. GMT and 11 a.m. West African time, 12 a.m., 12 p.m. or 12 noon Central African time, and 1 p.m. East African time. Please, let's all come and then listen to the third and final presentation on open science and libraries. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you everyone for listening. Talk to you next week.
Thank you, Valerie. We appreciate you.